Okay, so it's officially 8:31 Israel time. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to learn next week and not the following week. I only got one opinion, but that was my opinion also. So because it'll be Erev Hanukkah in Chutz La'aretz, but it'll be the first night here. And the second Sunday is uh, it's Hanukkah break for Midrash Rachel, so that sort of works works well. Okay, so there are two sections that we're dealing with here where we are dealing with the klalot and brachot that Noach gives to his children to and his grandchild, I guess, right? So it's interesting that Ham doesn't get anything said to him. He gets a silent treatment. Um, but as we saw at the end of last week in Perek Tet, Pasuk Chavav, so Canaan is cursed. There's going to be Eved Avadim le'echav. We'll see what that might mean in the Ramban. Literally, it would be to his brothers. Right? I think the Ramban suggests that as one obvious possibility. We'll see what the other possibilities are as well. I want to just first go through the next couple of psukim and point out the two major issues that exist. Yeah. Okay. So in pasuk Chavav, Vayomer Baruch Adonai Elohei Shem V'Yeknan Eved Lamo. Now, Lamo is a poetic way of saying Lahem. Okay, everybody agrees to that. That's if you look at the Targum, Lahon. That's what Lahon in Aramaic, Lahem in Hebrew. So bear that in mind, right? As we translate, so blessed is God, the God of Shem, and Canaan will be a servant or slave to them. But you'll notice, by the way, there's no bracha of Shem per se here, right? He blesses God, like Melchizedek, Baruch El Elyon, right? Who bless God here too. Um, Noach is blessing God, but associating with Shem. Okay, continues in the next verse. Yaft, excuse me. Yaft Elohim leyafet v'yishkon be'olei Shem v'yeknan eved lamo. Okay, so Yaft, which according to the vast majority of commentators means to increase, right? God will increase to Yafet, will give him much, which is traditionally that's the idea of bracha. Bracha is to increase. Okay, what he's going to increase doesn't really say, but presumably good things. And he will dwell in the the tents of Shem. Sforno picks up on the fact that it says tents as opposed to tent. The simple understanding of tents, by the way, is Shem has more than one tent, right? Is homes, right? So God will dwell in the homes of Shem. Um, Everybody agrees. I always thought, I'm sure there must be a midrash that says it, that V'yishkon is referring to Yefet, but I couldn't find a single commentary that said that. So apparently, on the pshat level, V'yishkon is definitely speaking about God. Okay, so even though, or I don't know, even though God will increase Yefet, but He'll dwell. The vav here seems more like a but than an and. But He will dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan will be a slave or servant to them. So first of all, I want you to pick up on the parallelism between these two psukim, right? obviously very, very similar. One's dealing primarily with Shem, the other one um, also with Yefet. Okay. So there's that to begin with, that Yefet doesn't get his own verse, so to speak. But that said, there's a lot of parallelism, right? In other words, Baruch Hashem Elokei Shem, right, is equal to V'yishkon, excuse me, Yaft Elohim Liyaf V'yishkon Be'olei Shem. So there's an additional phrase, V'yishkon Be'olei Shem. So there's two phrases as opposed to one phrase in the first verse, and inclusion of Shem along with Yafet. But they both constitute ideas of bracha, and then they both conclude in the same way. Okay, so that is the similarities. Okay, now what are the differences? Besides the fact that besides what I mentioned, that there's an extra phrase of V'yishkon Be'olei Shem. What else is different between the two verses?
Yafes isn't included in the first one at all.
Right. Okay. So that's similar idea, right? That Yafet shares his pasuk with Shem, and Shem has its exclusive pasuk. What else is different? What else?
The blessed God in the first one.
Sorry?
Baruch Hashem.
Good. Yeah. What do you want to say about that?
And the second one is not a blessing of God, it's what God did to Yefet.
Okay. What else? Focusing on God. What else is different?
The first one is what Noach says, and the second one, sorry, is Chaf Zayin what Noach says, or is that narrative like?
Yeah, I think it's continuation. I think it sounds very much the continuation of Noach's speech. Yeah. Also because of the parallelism that's there. So yeah. Okay. So names of God, right? So we're always looking at the names of God. What's going on over there?
In the first one, we have the Tetragrammaton, and then the second one, it's Elohim.
Right. Good. Yefeh. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. So, that is correct. And several of the Mefarshim noticed that. Ultimately, there's an obvious reason for that. Shem is brought higher than Yafet, right? So Shem gets this honor. That's what you find in the Sforno, you find in the Even Ezra. But there's something else I want to focus on, and that's the word lamo, right? What's with lahem? Okay, so it's easier in the second verse. When it says lamo, Canaan is going to be an eved to them. Who would them likely be?
Are you asking in the first one or in the second one?
Second one. Second one's easier. So we're doing that.
The brothers.
Yeah, but which brothers?
Shem and Yefet.
Right, good. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Okay, so the problem is in the first verse, right? Because we only have one brother, right? As we've pointed out, right? So what are our possibilities? Who else could lahem be? So if you look at Rashi is very subtle. Rashi addresses this, but in a very subtle way. Other Mefarshim speak about it more clearly. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Baruch Hashem Elokei Shem, Shatid Lishmo Avtachto Lizaro, Letet lahem et eretz Canaan. Okay, so who in the future, right, will guard his promise to his seed, meaning to Hashem's seed, to give them the land of Canaan. Okay, in those words, Rashi has told you who lahem is. Who's lahem? Why is it plural?
Their children?
Yeah, right. Zara, right? Exactly. His children. So the children's the plural, the his is in singular, but yeah, I assume that's what you meant. So that's one possibility, right? The Chizkuni, and according to Ramban, Ibn Ezra also, but we have a different version of the Ramban. What else is possible? Any other ideas? Let's see if you can figure out what they say. What else could it be? By the way, the Sforno says like Rashi. No, actually, that's not true. That's not true. The Sforno really says like the Hiskuni and Quasi Ibn Ezra. So what is that other possibility? What else could it be? Lahem. He's going to be slave to them. If it's not Zaro, and there's good reason not to say Zaro. Zaro is not really mentioned here, right? Presumably Rashi does that because of that problem of Lamo, right? It just says Shem. So who else could we bring into this verse that he could be a servant of?
Could it be Shem and Hashem?
Good, perfect. That's the other possibility. Good. Yeah. So Ramban hates that. The Ramban hates that possibility. Let's take a look in the
Why?
Ramban inside. All right, you tell me. You tell me why. So
Not sure why.
So one sentence. So let's speak it out. So that would mean that Canaan is being assigned to be a slave to Shem ben Noach, and a slave to God. Now, when you use that phrase normally, and you say Eved Hashem, what do you mean? Leah, you're saying something?
Like that you're serving Hashem,
Right.
We're all
Right. So that sounds like a good thing, right? That's why the Ramban doesn't like it, right? It sounds like a good thing. We're supposed to be Avdei Hashem. We're supposed to be slaves to God, not just servants. We're supposed to do anything He wants, and by being that, right, it brings us up. Incidentally, the Rav Shimshon Hirsch says that that's the way to bring Cham up, to make them follow rules, and submit them to order when their nature is to be wild, and that's not good for them. So that's the idea. Let's stick with the Ramban inside now that we've figured out what his problem might be. So look inside. V'Kanan Eved Lamo, Pirush Rabbi Avraham Ki Lamo, Shekanan Eved Lelohim U'Lashem. Right, just like Barry said, that Rabbi Avraham, which is the Ibn Ezra, explained that Lamo Lahem, right, to them is that Canaan should be a slave to God as well as for Shem. Ki hu yachrechenu la'avoda el, because Noach is forcing him, or Shem is forcing him, not clear, right, to serve God. Okay, so that's the way he quotes in the Ibn Ezra. Like I said, in our Ibn Ezra, we don't have it. However, both the Chizkuni and the Sforno say the same thing. So even if the Ibn Ezra doesn't say it, other Mefarshim say it. Barry said it. It makes sense, right? It makes sense on a pshat level. It makes more sense than Rashi because Zerah was never mentioned. who was mentioned? Shem and God, right? So there's only two. Lahem would seemingly be those two. So what's the problem? So a second. B'sheni. Okay, so right. Okay, B'sheni perish she'evid yefel Hashem. This we said in the second mention of Lamo. It means Yefet and Shem. Everybody agrees to that. That's nothing new. But now the Ramban's attack. Vimken Noach lekov oivav ba v'nei berech she'eh Kanan eved lelohim. So Ramban here paraphrases what Balak said to Bilam, right? When Balak hired Bilam to curse the Jews and he blessed them instead, this is what he said to them. So Rashi's, the Ramban saying that if we go with the Even Ezra, so Noach, instead of cursing his enemies, right, he came and blessed them and called Canaan an Eved Hashem, Eved Lelokim, right? So Ramban doesn't like that idea. He's often very critical, if you haven't noticed yet, of the Even Ezra. Later on in the Shir, I think we're going to see another place where he's very critical also. He then quotes Rashi. We'll skip that part. A few lines later, V'nachon beinai, right? So what does he think is going on? So he says, Kimitchila kilel oto she'eh eved avadim l'chol haolam v'ya kol motzei yavod bo ki tam la'achav l'chol bnei adam. So previously, when Noach said he should be a slave for all, right? It says in the end, in the last part of Pasuk Chaf Hey, right? He should be Eved Avadim le'echav. So what's le'echav, right? Up until that point. So says the Ramban, that means everybody. Kol bnei Adam, that's what echav means, his brothers, right? Also, don't forget, there's not so many brothers, there's not so many other people around. Again, we don't know exactly when this occurs, right? How many other children there were, but primarily what you're dealing with cousins at best, right? So not a lot of people. So on some level, Kol Bnei Adam at this point really means, they all are his brothers in the sense they're all pretty closely related. But given that this is meant to be a curse throughout the generations, so the ramifications are that it's going to be for all people. Kinyan v'shlach et kol ha'adam ish bere'ehu. Just giving examples where achim, the word ach is relating to, or reya here, is relating to all people. Katam ish ve'ish, etc. Okay, la'achiv. It says the thing is ola achiv, or maybe it meant Shem v'Yafet, even though they're not his siblings, not Canan's siblings, they're his uncles. Ki achi aviv yikru achiv, ketam ki nishva achiv, etc. You see in other places that a nephew or an uncle can be called a brother. And then finally, Shomrim la'achav bnei aviv, k'achrei yato eved livnei aviv, l'shem v'yefet v'nehu eved l'kol ha'olam. Okay, I don't want to spend more time on that part. It's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So let's continue. Right in the beginning, he blesses, meaning Noach blesses the God of Shem. That's to show that Shem is going to be serving God. Whereas Canaan is going to be serving him, Shem. Then finally, getting back to the question, Vilamo, right? What about Lamo? Yervos Lazaro Shel Shem Rabbeim. So he essentially goes along with Rashi. I'm not sure if he picked up that Rashi said that, the part that we skipped in Rashi. But in any case, he essentially goes as Rashi. What's the Rabbeim? Why is it plural? Why is it Lamo? He says it hints to the descendants of Shem. However, or it can go back to the previous verse, right? You don't have to read a verse as something completely new, even though there's, well, let me ask you, what's the reason to say that this shouldn't have anything to do with the previous verse? No, never mind. I take that back. I take it back. I mean, I was going to say it's a new statement, but the truth is, Noach, it's very likely the statements were said at one point. So if Noach said le'achiv in the previous verse, it could be that it continues, that the plural continues into this verse. That's his other suggestion. Okay, so that's a new suggestion, right? We have three possibilities. Rashi's, which the Ramban just had said, that Lamo is his offspring. We have Chizkuni, Beri, and possibly Ibn Ezra that say it's God and Shem. And now we have a third possibility that Lamo is the brothers in the previous verse, whoever they were, right? Ramban wasn't clear whether it's his uncles, meaning Shem and Yafet, or whether it's his brothers, right? His three other brothers. Okay. V'chazar birach Yefet b'chavat ha'gvul, like we said, Yefet is blessed, and Noach turns around, blesses them with enlarging borders. The enlargement is about territory. V'Shem b'shchan Elohim b'halav, and Shem by having God dwell in his tents. V'sheknan eved lamo l'shnehem, and they get the blessing that they're going to have Canaan's descendants serving both of them. Okay, right. And why does so is another question that comes out of it? Clearly, Noach is speaking about him being a slave to Shem, at least Shem, in Pasuk Chavav, and it's pretty clear that everybody seems to agree that in Pasuk Chav Zayin, he's talking also about Shem, right? He's talking about Yefet and Shem, right? So the question becomes, why is there a need to say twice about Shem? Right? We already know that he's an Eved to Shem, right? So tell me he's going to be an Eved to Yefet, right? You could either put it in between V'yishkon b'holei Shem or V'yeknan Eved leYefet, right? So the Ramban picks up on that issue, right? It's only truth is that's an issue for everyone because everybody includes Shem as someone in Chavav, and everybody includes him in Chav Zayin. So I don't know why other people don't address it, but in any case, the Ramban says, "V'nei avia Canaan l'Shem shnei pa'amim, remez ki hu yinchal alzo v'kol asher lo." So with Shem, says the Ramban, it's a hint that he's not only going to have him as a slave, but he's also going to take his land. Shem, meaning the Jews, right? As the descendants of Shem are going to take his land. Ki mashekana eved kana abo, because there's an idea that anything that belongs to a slave belongs to his master. Not necessarily Shem. It could have been Yefet also, but in fact, that's the point, that Shem gets the slavery twice, a double slavery, whereas Yefet only gets it once. Finally, the Ramban has a larger idea about what's the whole point of the story, right? In other words, it's not such a nice story, what happens with Noach. Why is it necessary to write it? So says the Rambam, "Nichtava zot haparasha lodia ki becheto haya Canaan eved olam v'zacha Avraham ba'artzo." So first of all, it's to make known that Canaan established his status as a result of his sin, and that Avram was able to acquire his land as a result. And as far as the wine, right, which you don't have to tell me that part of the story necessarily. So he says that it's important to tell us because Kieshbo Ashara Mimeno Yoter Parshat Nezirut, that there's a warning to people more than the parsha of the Nazir, Ki Tzadik Tamim Asher Tzidko Etzil Kol Olam, because we forget who Noach was, right? He says he was this great tzaddik whose righteousness saved the whole world. Even such a person was made to sin from wine. And brought him to a disgrace and cursing his own offspring. Right? So it's a very dramatic display of the dangers of wine. So that is why we need all the details here, says the Ramban. Okay. Tov.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Was Noah's sin with the wine just like that he planted it early, or that he got drunk at all? Because when he was naked, he was even in his tent already, and that seemed not so bad to me.
Right. So there are two things going on. Number one, as Rashi says, it seems that he started and focused his agricultural talents on that, on starting with vineyards, right? That's where his efforts were focused on, which can be seen as mixed up, as a lack of priorities. But ultimately, the sin, with wine, the issue is getting drunk. If you're going to use it, as with Kiddush, to simply change your mood, to bring you closer to God, there's no problem with it. Assuming, and this is a big assumption, that Noach knew what he was doing, right? Because it said, right, just like with Cain and Hevel, right, the famous midrash that Cain didn't know how to kill, right? He was just trying to hurt. He didn't realize that his hurting his brother would end up killing him, right? So here too, right, it's not so clear that Noach understood what he was doing. That said, I think in both cases, right, why is there responsibility? There's responsibility because there's a process, right? A lot of sins are not instant, are not just one-time affairs, but are progressive, right? And at each, it may be more difficult to stop in the process, but the further one goes, the more aware the person is. So I think that's where Noach is blamed. And the fact that, it's in his own tent, so that is, a redeeming factor. But with drunkenness, and again, to the extent that Noach understood drunkenness, with drunkenness, the fact that you're in your own home is not a protection, or I should say it's not complete protection, because there are doors, meaning people can come in, and even more likely is the person that's drunk will want to go out. So, incidentally, there's no punishment given to Noach per se. God doesn't punish him after the story, right? Possibly for some of the reasons that we just said. However, what happened to Noach was something he presumably was, very upset and regretful about, especially given his stature, as the Ramban says. I mean, it's really a terrible disgrace for such a great man, right? I mean, it's rare to have this sort of combination. Granted, we say, at the beginning of Parshat Noach, Noach adds Ishtei Tami Hai Bedorotav and Yesh Dorshim Lignai. Some say he was only a tzaddik because of his generation, right? Rashi brings both. That said, as the Ramban pointed out, right, the whole world was saved because of him. That's pretty big, right? Presumably, right, Shem was there too. It doesn't say that the world was saved for Shem. Shem was a good guy, right? So Noach must have been a great person, right? To have that sort of blemish on a person of Noach's stature is really big. I think we forget that. I think that's what the Ramban is pointing out. Again, not so much the punishment issue as much as sort of putting ourselves in a place that is opening ourselves up for tremendous I don't know what the right word is, but for tremendous downfall, right? I mean, we can only imagine in our age, right, that what sort of scandal that would be. And once there's a scandal like that, I mean, again, in the time of Tanakh, there was such a thing as tshuva, right? Today, I don't think it's even possible. Anyway, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but it's my reflections on it. So, is there anything else we want to talk about here? I think we've covered the main issues in this. Okay. So let's go on unless there's any other questions. Tough.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
In the second, like we were talking about the two parallel Pesukim, and in the second one, when it's saying that Hashem should increase Yafes and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, we were translating V'yishkon, dwell in the tents of Shem, as Hashem dwelling in the tents of Shem, but could we also say that Yafes is dwelling in the tents of?
Yes, so you might have missed it because I said,
sorry.
It's okay, no problem. That the two are definitely possible. They're definitely possible. The problem is that on pshat level, everybody I saw says talking about Hashem. And I looked around because I always thought it was Yafet.
Because it's the nearest antecedent.
Right, 100%. 100%. I suppose that on a pshat level, it doesn't make a lot of sense on pshat level for Yefet to dwell in the tents of Shem, right? It has to be highly figurative, which is I think how we tend to understand it, right? That the beauty of Yafet is most fitting in the tents of Shem. That's the way it's often presented. And I'm sure there must be someone who says that. As I said, I think it's definitely found in Midrash. I didn't find it offhand, but I'm sure it goes back to Chazal as a possible understanding. But on the pshat level, it seems like everybody was going in the other direction.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Thank
you're
you.
right. But you're right. In theory, grammatically, it certainly works. Right? Like I said, I think the only reason that Mefarshim don't like it on the pshat level is we're dealing about two empires, right? The whole point is they're not living together, right? So it doesn't really make so much sense on a pshat level.
I see.
Yeah. Okay. Next review, Noach, Achei Mabul, 300 shana v'chamishim shana, right? Giving us the age of Noach after the flood. V'yu kol yemei Noach, 900 shana v'chamishim shana v'yamot. Okay. Next, Ve'ele toldot bnei Noach, Shem, Cham, v'Yafet, v'yulid lehem banim, Achal Mabul. Right. So here we have the same order that we generally have, right? Which is Shem, Cham, and Yafet. And yet, the next verse, B'nei Yafet, Gomer, Magog, Madai, V'Yavan, V'Tuval, Umesha, V'Tiras. Right? So, by the way, of his children, we tend to identify him most strongly with Yavan. Rav Hirsch expands greatly on this section. It's worth reading, but it's quite lengthy. He says that all of civilization is based on one child of Yefet and one child of Shem. In terms of Shem, ultimately the Jews, right, Avraham, and in terms of, which is a few generations later, and in terms of Yefet, it's Yavan, right? These are the two ones that carry civilization. For Rav Hirsch, he speaks about spirit. What was it? Sense, spirit, sensuality. Spirit being Shem, sensuality being Cham, and Yefet. I think he talks about sensitivity, something that effect. And that there's a role for all three, but the third one needs to be kept in control. So anyway, but what I wanted to point out here is that the order of the offspring is the opposite of what we just saw, right? If you remember from last week's shir and other times, we've spoken about the lack of clarity as to the order of the children, right? Seems that everybody agrees the Yefet is the oldest, and that would work very well in terms of starting with him and the genealogy, starting in Pasuk Bet over here, right? But what about Ham and Shem? So we said Benoah Katon, if it's speaking about previously his young son, when Yaakov was angry at his young son, if Ham is the youngest, then that fits well, but it may be that he's not. In fact, the next person on the list of genealogy, which is the next part of what we're going to look at, is Ham. It has been suggested that the Torah is going backwards order in terms of the genealogy from from what? Yafet. Yes, Yafet. In other words, the order, if you remember the way back, the Ramban gives an elaborate, difficult explanation for the order that it's presented, right? That Shem, Cham, Yafet, even though the order is presumably, the birth order is presumably Yafet, Shem, V'cham, whatever the reason for that order, the Torah is presenting, is going from the last mention first, right? Which is not unprecedented. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that. Let's move on to ask you to look at skip a few verses and go to Pasuk Vav. Okay, so here in fact we have the sons of Ham, Uvnei Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, Uchanan, right? And we talked about the Canaan seems to be the youngest of the four, based on the assumption that usually that's what's going on. Ramban disagreed with that. And in any case, Ubnei Kush, V'Chavila, V'Savta, V'Rama, V'Savteka, Ubnei Rama, Sheva, Udadan. V'Kush, these are names. V'Kush Yalad et Nimrod U'Achel, Liot Gibor, Ba'aretz. Okay. So here we have another character that the Torah is going to slow down on, right? We have this in a few places. In last week's Parsha, by the way, it was very interesting, really bizarre sort of parenthetical mention about Anna. Anna is one of the descendants of Esav. And if you picked it up, if you see Parsha Shavua, so it says that he was grazing his donkeys, and he found the Yemim. And there's a lot of confusion of what the Yemim were. Most say that he figured out how, I mean, Rashi says they figured out how to breed mules, right? But it's very late in history, in biblical history, for people to be figuring out how to do things, right? The people who figure out how to do things are pretty much in Parshat Bereshit. So other gives other explanations, but it's interesting that the Torah will sometimes stop about a certain person and give us a fact that seems almost random. In the case of last week's parsha, we're not even sure what he found. But in any case, Nimrod there's more meat here with Nimrod. It's a couple psukim. So first of all, Echel liot gibor ba'aretz. Let's just translate it the way most people translate it. That he began, right? Nimrod began to be a hero is the modern translation of Gibor. It's not what it means in like Shimshon Gibor means a strong man, right? He became a strong man in the land or in the world. I think one of the Mefarshim, maybe then Siv, says he was the first king, right? He created the idea of monarchy, of ruling over people. Okay, let's just go a couple psukim. Huya Gibor. Tzayid lifnei Adonai al ken yemar kenimrod gibor tzayid lifnei Adonai. So he he became a powerful hunter before God. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a powerful hunter in front of God. Okay, so first of all, Al Ken Yamar tends to be like with the bracha of Kefrain and Nashe, right? That this is what people say. They became a popular saying, right? So in fact, and this is, after all, the Torah is written, right, in the time of Moshe, so it's several hundred years later, and therefore there's a history after Nimrod. And presumably within that history, people are using this phrase, right? It doesn't say so much how it's used. It just says that it became an expression to be a Gibor Tzad Lifnei Hashem like Nimrod. Okay, so now we want to know what does the expression mean? Now, of this expression, Gibor Achal Lifnei Hashem, what interests us the most from this expression? What do you think?
What is a hunter before God? Like, what does that mean?
Okay, so which part isn't clear? because I want to know what are we interested in?
Lifnei Hashem, I guess. Like,
Yeah, I think so. That's certainly what seems to excite the Mefarshim. But you're right; it's also the combination. So I sort of understand them separately. I think to be before God, and I certainly understand what it is to be a hunter. But what does it mean to be a hunter before God? So let me ask you, what do you think? What do you think it might mean?
To hunt for God, like to get sacrifices?
Yeah, good. Okay, so that is what the Ibn Ezra says. That's what the Ibn Ezra says, more or less. Let's take a look. I don't know if anybody got a chance to look at it before. Let's see in Pasuk. That. Yeah. So first of all, what about the name Nimrod? Does that, I mean, I don't know if you saw Rashi, but does that say mean anything to you, Nimrod? in terms of a root? Do you see any root in it that means something? So if not, take a look at
Merid,
Rashi. Sorry, merid. Good. What does that mean?
like rebellion.
That's right. Good. Okay. So it's interesting that you have names in Tanakh that mean things. You know, it's funny because I realized we don't think when we hear Indian names like Big Feather or something. So we know that we associate it. Okay, a sitting bull, right? Right. So we associate it with the words. But when we see that in Tanakh, like Devorah or Rachel, we don't realize that's also names of animals, right? Devorah being a bee, Rachel being a lamb, right? So it seems, and I'm not the first to say it, that some of the names that the Torah gives to people may not be their actual names, but rather the way the Torah wants us to understand them. And here, right, certainly if you're going to learn like Rashi, then Nimrod is exactly that, right? He's a rebel. We'll see in Rashi in a minute, but let's start with Even Ezra. Um, so the Even Ezra says, Nimrod, al tivakesh tam lechol hashemot, im lo nichtav. Right? So Ramban, the Even Ezra, first of all, says, don't do that. Don't go there with the names. I'm not into the names unless the Torah tells me. If the Torah tells me why a name is, like Benjamin, again, recently in the Torah, in the reading in the Parsha, right? So Benjamin says, right, why he's called Benjamin. All the Shvatim, right, are named after events or things that happened, right? But says the Even Ezra, if it says it in the Torah, fine. If it doesn't, don't play word games with the right. Especially it's not even merid, it's Nimrod. Okay, so the Ramban don't go that way. On the pshat level, he's saying, maybe there's a hint, but maybe there isn't. Right? So on the pshat, you can't say that. So what's going on with this person? Vehu achel harod gvurot bnei adam al chayot. We said he's a hunter, so he began showing the power of people over animals, right? Meaning, right? Here also you're dealing with the first hunters, right? We said that people could not eat meat up until this point. So presumably hunting wasn't such a big thing. So as hunting becomes a thing, right? So Nimrod develops ways to hunt, right? All these things develop, right? Everything, human endeavors all develop. So he developed it, right? It was, according to Even Ezra, presumably an intellectual feat more than a physical feat. In any case, the Tam Lifnei Hashem, the part that really interests us and most Mefarshim, Shaya Bonei Mizbachot, just like Zelda said, Umalo Tam Achayot Ola Lashem, right? That he would use the hunting to sacrifice to God, right? At this point, Noach had introduced the idea again to the world in a big way. So Nimrod went with that. So that's what it means Lifnei Hashem. V'zov derech hapshat. Right? Drash derech acheret. He says, I know the drash is like Rashi, right? But he says, if you want the pshat, the drash in this case does not fit with the pshat. Okay, that's what the Even Ezra says. So there's a middle road. Well, should we do Rashi first? Yeah, let's do Rashi first, and then we'll see a middle road. Unfortunately, we don't have time to look in the Ramban. The Ramban hates this also, right? Same reason. He says that, what's the Evan Ezra doing? And it's very interesting that Ramban says we have a Masorah that Nimrod's a bad guy. That's what the Ramban says. Now that's a little slippery because Ramban himself will argue that Midrashim are not pshat. And we'll do it to Rashi, and Rashi will say something, and the Ramban will say it's very nice, but it's not pshat. Right? So it's not clear to me how the Ramban knows that this is a Masorah. I think, and this I have from my teacher of Lichtenstein, that major character descriptions are Masorah. For example, someone will say David HaMelech was really a bad guy. Right? So you can look in Tanakh and say all these bad things, right? So that goes against our Masorah, right? Even if you can say on Pshat level that he's a bad guy, it's not true, because we have a tradition that he's not a bad guy, he's a hero, he's a good guy, right? So I assume that that's what the Ramban is saying by Nimrod, that we have a tradition about him in general. And to say that he was, making the Lifnei Hashem says that he's worshiping God, goes against that. It flies in the face of the major tradition. That's essentially what he says. So let's see what the tradition says. Rashi essentially presents it, right? Liot Gibor, looking chet on Rashi, L'hamrid kol olam ala Kadosh Baruch Hu betzat dor haflaga, right? To bring the whole world to rebel against God with the advice of the generation of the flaga, of the division, right? That's with the tower. It's the next story we're going to study next week, right? So this sort of sets the tone for that. He's the one who is at the head of that plan, right? We know that plan is rebellious, and even though it doesn't say in that story that Nimrod's in charge, there are indications from here, and this Rashi is building on. Let's keep looking. The next verse in Rashi, Pasuk Tet, Gibor Tzayid, Tzad Datan Shel Briot, Bifiv, Umit'an Limrod B'makom. Right? So he hunts the minds of people. Right? It's very interesting. We have the same connotation by Esav, right? If you remember that he would hunt his father with his mouth. So the same idea is over here, right? That he would hunt, that Nimrod would hunt people, it would hunt their minds. Hunting is essentially a way of saying manipulating, right? Of being control of something that's otherwise independent, and to bring claims towards rebelling against the makom, against God. Lifnei Hashem, finally, mitkaven lahaknito al panav. So says Rashi, right? Lifnei Hashem is making his behavior more outrageous, right? He was doing all this, which was bad enough, but he did it in front of God, right? He intended to show God up, so to speak, not to hide what he was doing from God, but rather to do it in front of him. Al ken yomar kenimrod kol adam marshia be'azut panim yodea ribono umitkaven limrod bo yamar ze kenimrod gibor tzayid. So it says Rashi, when a person says that, they're not talking about great hunters or powerful men. They're talking about when you see someone who brings evil with azut panim, with chutzpah, right? Is in front of God, right? Is not embarrassed to rebel against God in front of him. Yodea ribono, knows his master, but intends to rebel against him. About such a person, says Rashi, that's who people compare to Nimrod. Okay, I said there's a third approach There's a third approach, which you find in the Radak and the Chizkuni. I think I assigned the Chizkuni again. I don't know if anybody had time to look at it, but in any case, if you have the Chizkuni in front of you, take a look. It's a middle approach about what Lifnei Hashem can mean. According to the Ibn Ezra, the simple pshat is very good, meaning it's very complementary to Nimrod, in spite of what the Midrashim have to say. According to Rashi, no, the Midrashim speak out what really is going on. This is the Ramban supporting Rashi in this case. We have a Masoret about Nimrod. We have a tradition that this is actually who he was. Says the Chizkuni, who was very familiar with Rashi, differently. He says, Gibor tzad lifnei Hashem. He says, Be'olam. Right, what does lifnei Hashem mean? In the world, right? We'll see what the connotation of that is in a second. First, he brings a couple of proofs. V'chen ir gdola l'Elohim, speaking about the city of Nineveh in Sefer Yonah. It says that the city was a great city or a big city to God, right? What does that mean? Similar to here, right? In other words, did God have a special relationship to Nineveh? Not clear that he does. I mean, the Rashi later on says that Nineveh had a special schut, but even so, it's not like, Jerusalem and Nineveh. So he goes further and explains, what did it mean over there? That there's no city in all of God's world like Nineveh, right? So it was outstanding. When something is outstanding, one way to say it is to associate it with God, in God's world. This is the city in God's world. This is the man in God's world. Dvacher, lifnei Shem al pi hadibur. Then the Hiskuni's second shot is actually closer to the Ibn Ezra. That lifnei Hashem was God's will, or not really, God's statement. God told Nimrod to be a Gibor Tzayid, right? Kamo arur ha'ish lifnei Hashem asher yikum uvana et ha'ir hazot, etc. about Yericho. And then if you skip a few lines, he explains what he means. Mimarom nigzar al Nimrod shetitzlach ruach gevura alav v'yitpos nitzchon bechol asher yelech. That it was decreed by God that he would be successful. So the Hiskuni presents a middle path and Radak actually says it better, that it just means great. Lifnei Hashem just means great. He was a great hunter. That's one shot. The second shot is the Ibn Ezra, but not quite as radical. He's saying that God decreed, Lifnei Hashem just means that God was involved in making Nimrod as powerful as he was. It doesn't mean that God liked him, right? It means that he had a role for Nimrod and allowed him to play this role of great strength and power, right? It's not the same as the Ibn Ezra saying that Lifnei Hashem, that Nimrod sought God, right? But rather God sought Nimrod, which is not necessarily a good thing, right? God seeks a lot of people, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, right? Like with same region with Nebuchadnezzar, right? Very horrible person, but he's in Tanakh, he's spoken about as God's tool. So here too, Nimrod could be that as well. Okay. Tov, okay, there's one more pasuk about Ashur, who disagrees with Nimrod, but I think it's not necessary. Maybe we'll do it next week. So as I said at the beginning, those who came on late and those who are listening on the recorded message, recorded shiur, I guess, we will meet this coming week. First Ner Rishon of Hanukkah, the first night of Hanukkah here in Israel, Erev Hanukkah in Chutz La'aretz next Sunday, but we will skip the following week, and I think the week after that is going to be our final week for this series. So, but B'ezras Hashem, we have 2 more shiurim. So look forward to seeing everybody. Shavua Tov, and I won't say Happy Hanukkah yet, but we'll something to look forward to. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
You.